The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for spending your lunchtime hour with us today. My name is Elise Shadler, and I work for the Vermont Urban and Community Forestry Program, which is a collaborative program of the Vermont Department of Forest Parks and Recreation and University of Vermont Extension. If you'd like to find out more about our program, you can visit our website at www.vtcommunityforestry.org. Today's webinar presentation is titled The Importance of Trees in Stormwater Management, and our presenter this afternoon is Becky Tharp. Becky manages the Green Infrastructure Collaborative, a joint program of Lake Champlain's Sea Grant and the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation, developed in the summer of 2015. The collaborative promotes low-impact development and green infrastructure, green stormwater infrastructure, and these practices are promoted as the preferred methodologies to manage stormwater runoff from developed lands in Vermont. This work includes the coordination of the Green Infrastructure Roundtable, an ad hoc group of individuals from the public and private sector who come together on a quarterly basis to discuss various aspects of low-impact development and green stormwater infrastructure. Further efforts include development of technical green stormwater infrastructure trainings for design professionals, a new career conference for college students, and continued research on green stormwater infrastructure practices. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a couple of logistics about this webinar presentation. As participants, your microphones will be muted during the entire presentation. As they arise, please use either the chat box or the questions box at the bottom of the GoToWebinar side panel to type in any questions you have. And at the end of Becky's presentation, she will address the questions in the order in which they came as time allows. After the presentation, you will be sent an email with a link to a very short evaluation survey. Please fill this survey out so that we can continue to improve and guide our future webinars and programming. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website, www.vtcommunityforestry.org, as a YouTube video by the beginning of next week. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand over the presentation to Becky, and I hope you enjoy it.
To be talking to a bunch of tree huggers today because I love trees too, and there's lots to love. But as I'll discuss today, my tree appreciation is with special attention to their stormwater mitigation performance. But I think the great thing about trees is that no matter why you plant them or why you protect them, you still get all the benefits at no additional cost. So a little overview of what we'll talk about today. So just so we're on the same page, I'll briefly outline the issues that we're experiencing with stormwater runoff in Vermont and really around the country. And this is really a discussion about changing land use and tipping the hydrologic balance so that these impacts to water quality are at this point measurable and in some cases extreme. And I'll touch on how stormwater is usually managed and then what we mean by low impact development versus green stormwater infrastructure. And then we'll get to the good stuff, the stuff you probably came for, which is the role of trees in addressing stormwater woes. And throughout, I'll get specific and offer some examples from Vermont. I'll highlight two case studies. One is about how to protect big, beautiful trees where they are, even in the midst of major redevelopment. And one is focusing on bringing soil volume to tree needs into the urban environment. Lastly, I'll tell you about a new resource from the Vermont DEC Stormwater Program, Stone Environmental, and the Vermont League of Cities and Towns on how to calculate the value of trees, both their preservation and new planting. So that'll be if you're not familiar with that tool, I think you'll find that helpful. Okay, so I'm just going to back up and talk about stormwater a little bit and about our pollution concerns and why we would even care about what trees have to offer for stormwater. So 40 years ago, our major pollution concern was point source. And so that means the stuff that's coming in out of the end of a pipe, like a wastewater treatment plant or a manufacturing facility. Amendments to the Clean Water Act in the 1970s, though, largely addressed those concerns. So point sources are no longer the leading source of pollution to our waterways. Now it's from non-point sources. That's sources that come from across the landscape. They're much harder to address because they don't come out at the end of a pipe, and it's harder to point to exactly where it's coming from. So how does that happen? The process of hydrology, or the processes that happen in hydrology, are somewhat predictable, and different processes work on varying time scales. So this will probably be familiar to all of you, that condensation, precipitation, evaporation, transpiration, and infiltration are the major processes that happen in the water cycle. Those processes each take a different time scale. So for instance, surface runoff, which is in a natural landscape a small portion of where the water moves as it hits the ground, that's on a really short time scale, sometimes seconds, minutes, and hours at the longest. Subsurface flow, so that's like your shallow groundwater flow, is on a longer time scale, months to years. And then deeper groundwater flow can take years to decades. And what that means is that's the time it takes for it to sort of complete the cycle. So it's falling from precipitation and then being evaporated back up into the atmosphere. So like I just touched briefly, the natural systems hydrology, although there's a real variability in any natural forested conditions, they'll look something similar to this process diagram, where you have a 40 to 50% evapotranspiration, but anywhere between 1 to 10% would be in runoff, so that's the water hits the ground and then it flows directly off the surface and then into a water body. You get about 25% shallow and 25% deep infiltration. So the important thing about this slide, and what I want you to take away from it, is that the largest percentage contribution to water uptake in a natural system is through evapotranspiration. It's 40 to 50%. So trees do this work. This is what we're trying to mimic when we move over into green stormwater infrastructure. It's the sum of evaporation and transpiration movement through the plant and out into the atmosphere, and it's a really critical part of the water cycle, without which major disruptions would happen. So what happens when we disrupt the water cycle? So this is a schematic of what the water cycle looks like after we've removed trees and developed a lot. And humans have a tendency to alter the hydrologic cycle because we're involved in agriculture and industry. We put in dams, we deforest, we withdraw groundwater, and we urbanize. And all those alterations lead to really drastic disruptions in the water cycle. So reductions in evaporation and transpiration due to vegetation clearing, reductions in water holding capacity due to compaction and removal of topsoil, and increased surface runoff due to additional impervious cover. So the most important takeaway from this slide would be to look at the change in evapotranspiration from 40 to 50% in the natural cover environment down to 25% in developed conditions. So, that's almost a half, or if we go with the 50% evapotranspiration rate in the natural environment, that's a half reduction of what was happening in a natural cover. The other notable change is the drastic increase in surface runoff. So it moved from less than 1 to 10% to about 30% of the water that falls now running off. And these disruptions to the water cycle have a significant impact on water quality. So impervious cover in Chittenden County increased 4.3% between 1992 and 2006. And 60.3 or 9% of all assessed streams in Vermont are considered impaired for aquatic life. And water bodies that are impaired, that means that they don't meet state or federal guidelines for conditions that support balance. So that could mean excess nutrients, salts, temperature, flow, particulates, or other measures. In short, the water isn't good. And 12% of the total acreage of Lake Champlain is considered impaired for aquatic life, and 38% of the total acreage of all other inland lakes are impaired for aquatic life. Now, certainly, stormwater runoff is not the sole reason for this, but it's a major contributor. This is just, I just like kind of showing this slide because it can help put this in perspective. So one of the issues we have with stormwater is both that it is dirtier than rainwater is, but the other problem is the volume that it contributes to the natural systems. So a 1-inch rainstorm over an acre, if you did the calculation for forest runoff, you would have just under 3,000 gallons that would run off of that lot. The rest of it would be taken up by trees, or it would infiltrate into shallow or deep groundwater. In an urban environment, you could have upwards of 15,000 gallons. So it's a huge increase. We talk about urbanization. And if you spread that over downtown Burlington, when we get a 1-inch rain event, you're looking at 148 million gallons of water. Or for those of you who like to think in terms of Olympic-sized swimming pools, it would be 225 of those. So it's a huge volume of water, and it's really too much for our little streams to handle. So how do we handle it right now? Largely, we deal with it by using traditional or gray stormwater infrastructure. So overview of that is it's treating stormwater as a waste. It's not a resource. It's considered last in the design process. These are the pipes, convey strategies, centralized holding ponds. It looks mostly at surface runoff. It's reliant on large infrastructure, and there's no effort to try and restore natural hydrology. It's really just about addressing the surface runoff volume problem. So these are just a couple of photos. That's probably looks familiar to most of you, detention pond and an end of a pipe. And what happens with this traditional stormwater management is it leads to the same thing. You know, it doesn't really solve many of these problems. You're looking at sedimentation and erosion, nutrient loading to the streams, bacteria, trace metals, trash and debris, reductions in base flow to your streams. And what that means is if you have a base flow of a stream in a natural environment, it will always flow at about the same rate when it isn't raining. You don't get huge spikes and troughs in the flow. And in an urban environment, you could see streams that would dry up in the dry months and then be really heavily overfilled after a rain event. And it isn't good. You end up with that erosive look like you see with that photo on the bottom. So what's the alternative? I'm going to talk a little bit about low-impact development just to make the point that what our program does, and it's really a movement across the country and in other places in the world that have been doing it for longer. We're trying to reverse the way we do development so that you don't end up treating stormwater as something to manage at the end, but really rather part of the design process. So low-impact development was the term was coined in Maryland in 1990, but it's really like a land planning and design approach, and the goal of it is to maintain a site's pre-development hydrologic function, and you do that through the protection, enhancement, and or mimicry of natural processes. So basically you're leaving natural areas alone, and then you're minimizing disturbance from the development itself. And what it means in practice is just avoiding groves of large mature trees, keeping away from established wetlands, while developing in a lot. And these are sort of the key terms associated with low-impact development, which you may be familiar to you. Minimize total disturbance, conservation, disconnecting stormwater, protecting sensitive areas. So what it looks like in practice is narrower road widths, clustering your development, so you still have wide swaths of undeveloped forested land, but maybe the same total number of structures, but in a smaller area. And conservation and protection of natural areas. And now this is true for both large swaths of natural areas, but it can also be true for individual trees, where you have a specimen that should be protected and can't be replaced with less than 30 years of growth. But why? Why are trees important, and what do they do exactly to make them valuable for stormwater management? Well, everyone here today probably has some affinity for trees, and there is a lot to love. They improve regional air quality, reduce stream channel erosion, improve soil and water quality, provide habitat for terrestrial and aquatic wildlife, reduce summer air and water temperatures. There's also research linking them to increase property values, community space making, urban heat island mitigation, and an increase in general feelings of well-being. But today we're focused on one more reason to love the trees, and that's their incredible and really unmatched capacity to reduce urban stormwater volume and to improve the quality of the water flowing to our streams and lakes. So they do that by three main processes. The first is interception. So a large mature tree can intercept more than 2,000 gallons of stormwater in a year just by capturing it in its trees as the rainfall falls on them. And trees also capture through leaf interception the initial 1/10 of an inch of rain, and there's some studies that there's sort of some variability on where those numbers come from, but that's the best number I was able to find is about 1/10 of an inch of a rain event. The other thing they do, which has to do with interception, is reducing the rainfall velocity. So you end up with less erosion. So when a raindrop is falling from a cloud, it hits a tree leaf. So it slows it down. Therefore, when it eventually hits the ground, it's moving slower and maybe even a smaller droplet at that point. And that means it's carrying less energy and less erosive force when it hits the ground on impact. And that's important for stormwater purposes and important for water quality, because then that droplet of rain wouldn't be picking up sediment and then delivering it to our streams. The other important thing that trees do is through their process of evapotranspiration. So if you remember that hydrologic cycle form that I showed you, you saw that that's a really major part of our water cycle. And a large mature tree can transpire 40,000 gallons of stormwater in a year, and that's just one tree. The stormwater benefit of trees exceeds many other stormwater infrastructure practices, and trees are simultaneously providing all those other additional benefits. Whereas some of these other stormwater practices, their sole function is just to manage stormwater, and they cannot operate as well as a mature tree. Lastly, infiltration. Healthy trees really rely on healthy soil, and I'll talk a little bit more about this as we get into some of the case studies. But healthy trees, soils also rely on healthy trees. Healthy trees add organic matter to soils, and they help keep the ground loose and more readily able to infiltrate. Infiltration is a really key part of the water cycle. As you saw before, it's 50% of where the water goes in a natural environment. So the takeaway here, though, before we sort of move into these case studies, is that trees really represent the most economical stormwater management investment with multiple benefits that come outside of stormwater that I think we as a people agree are important benefits. But none of it's possible without healthy soil and vice versa. So I'm going to touch on the first one is this case study from the Waterways State Office Complex. Those of you who are local will sort of know some of the story of this. The Waterways State Office Complex is located in Waterbury, Vermont, which is along the Winooski River. And when they were hit really hard by Tropical Storm Irene, there was major flooding and damage done to those office complex. Through funding from state and federal sources, the office complex has been restored, and I think some state employees have already moved back in there, but it's important for the economic viability of that town that those office complexes be put back up into use. There were about 10 large trees that were on site, maples and oaks, that were targeted for preservation. Now, it's important to note that they were targeted for preservation more for the beauty and the historic value of the trees and not so much for the stormwater benefit. But because trees provide a number of these values, even when one value isn't the focus of the preservation effort, you still get the other values. And I just want to thanks to Adam Ports, who's a landscape architect and senior associate at the SC Group. He sent these photographs and the information about this redevelopment effort, and he also gave some really great points on how to do tree protection during a major redevelopment effort, which we're going to highlight here. So Adam says one of the most important things when you're trying to protect trees when you're going into a development effort is to complete an accurate survey of existing trees and even go beyond what the survey provides. He says it's important to, what they did was they reviewed each canopy accurately for size. They conducted a tree assessment report outlining the species, diameter, breast height, the health, recommendations for survival, and health improvement. And he said it's really step one before you start. And he had this series of fantastic photos that he sent. So this is gorgeous oak that's right next to this building that's being dismantled, and you can see it's really close proximity to some of this to this building that's coming down. This photo on the left, that tree is really right up against that structure, and it was able to be protected because they went through really careful process. Here's a great one. There's just really construction all around this tree and compaction, but that tree has is surrounded by a chain link fence to make sure that construction vehicles can't go within an area where the roots are and potentially damage the tree. So Adam said the second thing that's important about protecting large trees in a redevelopment site is to develop a thorough tree protection plan. So a standalone plan that follows existing conditions and precedes erosion's control. So the plan should include tree protection details, and that should be installed prior to any construction work on the project. So these photos really exhibit how they were able to go about that. Some fantastic photos of these large trees really in the midst of what might seem like a chaotic construction site, and they're being really carefully protected. So this is a schematic of what the tree protection standards would look like. And Adam said this was really important too, that they needed to have tree protection details and specifications. They developed a thorough specs that the contractor was responsible for. And he said it really was important to include fencing, signage, root pruning, conditions for filling and excavation, monitoring, and then also a plan for payment for any damage. His point here, I think, is that preserving these trees was so important that in order to make sure that it happened, it really needed to be an official part of the design and planning for the project. Lastly, he said it was important to carry an allowance for tree pruning and arborist services, so that that's part of the budget heading in, that it isn't really just all about the roads and the buildings, but the trees were an important part of the project. Lastly, Adam had mentioned that construction administration was really important. So he used the word relentless, to be relentless in monitoring and talking with contractors about the importance of saving the trees. He said they would be on site, and if fencing was moved for some reason, they were alerting construction workers about the conditions and the need to locate all the fencing as per the contract documents. And I don't think that's probably not a surprise for anybody who works on construction sites. It's important for any oversight that you really need to be present and make a point of reminding people of what the priorities are. But I thought that was a great reminder that in protecting trees, that was an important piece of his work on this site. Some other photos from the construction project is that beautiful tree in the right-hand side surrounded by fencing, and then really out from there it's got to be compacted soils and a more difficult living environment for the tree for sure. So here's this tree surrounded by the fencing during construction, and then Elise sent this gorgeous photo from just this weekend, same site. Let's go toggle back and forth there. And there it is. So the construction is largely done on the site, and the trees are gorgeous and still standing. So you get this real nice historic sense of place. You also get the stormwater benefits of the trees in the interception, evapotranspiration, even on a site that had a major redevelopment. So we talked a little bit about low-impact development and how that's really about site design and preservation of natural infrastructure and high-value vegetation. But what's the difference between that and green stormwater infrastructure? This happens to be important to me because it's in the title of my job, so I feel like I have to always make a distinction between the two. But I do think it's an important distinction. So green stormwater infrastructure, that term was coined later, around 2007 by the EPA versus the LID, or low impact design or low impact development, which was in the 90s. And green stormwater infrastructure really refers to systems and practices that restore and maintain natural hydrologic processes. They're physical infrastructure. It's not a design process. It's really the physical thing. And the goal is to reduce the volume and improve the water quality that, that the built environment has. It's often incorrectly used as a synonym for LID, but they are different, and I think it's an important distinction. So for LID, the focus is on preservation or the process, and in GSI, the focus is on the actual infrastructure. And this is often most focused on new installations, and there's some design and engineering component of it. So these are the three principles that GSI sort of works within. All the practices that you hear described as green stormwater infrastructure will achieve one or more of these goals to preserve natural pre-development hydrology. Notice that trees alone achieve at least two of these, infiltrating and evapotranspiring. So I think that's pretty awesome. You get 2/3 of any of the options you would get within green stormwater infrastructure just by planting a tree. So these are some practices that you may have seen referred to before as green stormwater infrastructure practices. They're things like bioretention or rain gardens, vegetated swales, cisterns or rain barrels, green roofs, permeable pavements, gravel wetlands, tree boxes, usually with infiltration, filtering, or storage, and dry wells. So these are the most common ones, and they may be familiar to you. But a tree can be this infrastructure too, particularly where stormwater is purposefully directed towards a tree for added filtration or benefit of uptake. So what's good for trees is also good for soil. So this is part of sort of what I mentioned earlier about the connection between healthy trees and healthy soil. Trees like well-drained soil with 50% pore space for air and water, and that means no compaction. So that was one of the elements that was really important about that waterbury process, was not compacting the soil around the trees. It has a high exchange capacity. It needs healthy, diverse biology in the soils, and that's the same thing that's good for stormwater. That's the same thing we're trying to achieve when we do infiltration practices and bioinfiltration. We're trying to get no compaction, high exchange capacity, and 50% pore space. We need healthy, large plants, which, when we're talking about plants, really that means trees. And in order to get those, we need healthy soils. 25% of the total soil volume is usable as part of the water quality and quantity treatment stream. Low compacted water absorbing soil is approximately 50% mineral and 50% void space. And half of that void space is what's called macro pores, meaning the water fills these pores during a rain event and then the water drains slowly by gravity at a lower level. But the other half of the voids are micropores, meaning the pores are so small that the water remains held against gravity by surface tension and capillary action. And much of this water is evapotranspired by the tree back into the atmosphere. But the macropores release water so slowly that the water in the micropores is normally not figured water storage calculations, as they would already be filled during periods of frequent rain events. Water in the micropores is an important part of long-term water management strategy of the tree. So why I bring that up and why I think this is an important point for this discussion is that when we're designing green stormwater infrastructure practices, we're really considering macropores. We're considering the holding properties and the holding ability of the soils. And trees take advantage of another part of the holding capacity of the soils, and that's these micropores. And they're able to convert water that are held in both back up into the atmosphere. And in many bioretention installations or rain gardens, you have smaller plants, and you may not be getting the you certainly wouldn't be getting the same evapotranspiration quality or the interception quality that you would with a tree. So you're really relying on the soils. And the point is, if you have a tree that has enough soil volume, you get the benefit both of these healthy soils that are able to absorb and hold water, and then also the incredible benefit of the tree to uptake that water and move it back up into the atmosphere. So this schematic shows clearly the relationship between the available soil volume and the crown or the spread of a tree. if we want big trees, we need big soil area for the roots to access. And in large grassy areas, like on campuses like that Waterbury complex, that might not be that hard. They're these big, wide open lawn spaces. But giving trees access to lots of soil is more difficult in urban areas. How do you get the soil volume you need and keep your roads and buildings and sidewalks intact that are all really built up right around and adjacent to trees? Well, here's one method. The silvocell gives access to lots of uncompacted soil, even in dense urban environments. So it'll look like any other street tree box, but it has the added benefit of giving the tree and our stormwater what it needs, and that is soil volume. There are other products and methods to get at this endpoint, but the important element I'm going for here is that it allows the tree to access lots of soil volume that it needs in order to get big. So what is it exactly? It's really just this matrix of underground supports that hold up the pavement for sidewalks and streets. And it makes room for large volumes of this fluffy soil for tree growth. So essentially, it's just a way to maximize the volume of soil available for big, healthy trees without taking away space in tight downtown areas that are needed for parking spots and driving surfaces and sidewalks. So we have some of these in Vermont, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about an installation in Burlington on Cherry Street, right downtown. It's kind of almost at the cross street of Church, if you're familiar with the area. So this particular installation went in about 2 years ago, maybe a little bit more than that now, and it was designed as a flow-through system. So it would take water from a storm drain inlet the tree was sitting in, and it was accessible. And it would discharge this cleaner and less volume water back into the storm sewer on the other side of it. So here's a little cross section of that silvocell. So you have the water coming in from an inlet on the street, flows through the system, and then this is the silvocell installed. So you can see on the left where that new pavement is that kind of runs in front of and behind the tree. So that's where the sidewalk was dug up, and also a portion of the street was dug up out away in the same lateral space, but then out into the street. And that was all dug up and installed with that matrix and filled in with all that soil volume. So there you can see Megan Moyer, and I think that's the tree warden for the city of Burlington, checking out that nice, beautiful elm tree that was planted. So this project was really cool, and we were excited that it was going in. It's not a cheap tree. The cost is approximately $40,000. This one was funded by the Burlington Stormwater Management Program, so that's supported by stormwater user fees. And they also got a 319 grant through the Vermont DEC. It's pretty expensive for a street tree, but the life expectancy and the maximum expected growth for this tree is far greater than any other species that would be grown in a box. So a little update on this, on the status of this project. The inlet to the Cherry Street silvocell is actually currently blocked. So what happened here is that an adjacent landowner reported experiencing basement moisture problems really soon after the silvocell was installed. This also happened to be during a really wet spring. It was spring of 2014, which was excessively wet in this area. And measures were taken during the design and construction to ensure that that wouldn't happen. They had a liner on that side of the silvocell, and there was an under drain. But they haven't been able to figure out if it is contributing to a wet basement, so they had to block off the inlet. But even with it blocked off from inlet from the storm sewer on the street, the tree at least has more soil than your average urban street tree. So even when the project experiences a setback like this, when the installation and the stormwater management tactic is a tree with lots of soil to access, it's still a winner for stormwater. So that tree will grow a large canopy because it has all this soil volume. It'll outlive all of its neighboring trees, and it'll provide stormwater benefits even when the flow-through stormwater system is not connected, because it will be intercepting rainfall, and it still has infiltration capacity through its soils, even though it's not getting extra stormwater input. And I think, the reason I highlighted this particular project, and I tend to highlight this one a lot, even though in some cases it may be called a failure because right now it's not really functioning as it was designed, I think it really points to the quality of trees to be able to reach these multiple benefits. If this were a stormwater pond and there was a failure at the inlet and therefore it were blocked off, you would say that that project was a complete failure because it's not reaching any of its goals. It's not doing what it was designed to do at all, and therefore it's not doing anything. But in the case of a tree, even when things go differently than had been planned, there is still a benefit to planting a tree and giving it access to soil volume. And there's still a stormwater benefit even when we're not directing stormwater from the street into the soil volume. And I think that's a really important point. And I know that many people have different reasons for wanting to use trees in different settings, and they're not all stormwater. And I just want to point out that even if your motivation is not stormwater based, we still are going to get that stormwater benefit. So thank you for planting trees. All right, so lastly, I'm just going to go through one other thing that I want to show you guys, and that is how to quantify a tree's value. So there were these sizing tool fact sheets and a model bylaw and a sizing tool spreadsheet created by A&R and the Vermont League of Cities and Towns and Stone Environmental. It came out just a few months ago. And the sizing tool, in conjunction with the fact sheets and the model bylaw, determines the appropriate stormwater credit for either retaining or planting new trees. And it's appropriate to apply to sub-jurisdictional projects, meaning below a half an acre. So projects that wouldn't trigger a state stormwater permit, but you would still certainly get a lot of benefit out of managing that stormwater some other way. So we're going to just run through an example of how the tool works so you can apply them to sites where tree retention or planting may be influenced by stormwater considerations, so you can kind of see how that works. And I think I'm going to have to go like that. Okay. So you're all going to follow me on a magical adventure to the interweb. All right, so here are the sizing sheet, the simplified sizing tool for small projects fact sheets. I think we found at this web address, which you can grab here, and I will also share at the end if you need it again. There we go. And fact sheet number 3 focuses on the retention or planting of trees. So there's 10 fact sheets in this series, and they include information on soil depth, the rain gardens, enviroretention, grass swale cisterns, rooftop disconnection, dry wells, all the stuff we went over at the beginning of the presentation. But most germane to this discussion is this section on trees. And fact sheet number 3 is dedicated to determining the potential stormwater credit for retaining existing or planting new trees. And they include detailed guidance on how to protect trees during construction, some of those things that we had learned from Adam about how they protected those trees at the waterway complex. The same principles can be applied to small sites. And they give you guidance on how to determine if a tree would be eligible for stormwater credit. Now, granted, maybe you don't get any stormwater credit for planting a tree, but it still is a useful exercise to go through and look at sort of how to get the most out of trees if you are looking to get a stormwater benefit. Most important is the size and the proximity to impervious surfaces. So they're looking for the proximity to impervious surfaces to be 20 feet or less. And they also have information in there on maintenance and care during establishment and replacement timeframes when those trees should be replaced with new ones. And the fact sheets and the associated sizing tool provide developments with a quantitative way to measure the value or the offset in terms of impervious area. So it's essentially a tool for incentivizing the protection and planting of trees, among other things, in terms of stormwater. So it's a really neat tool. If you haven't checked it out, I think you'll enjoy it. In terms of these fact sheets and this tool, sizing tool, the credit can't exceed 25% of the total impervious area for the site, because you can't just sort of, I guess the idea is that you don't want to be able to plant a bunch of trees all jumbled up in one area and then pave over the rest of your site and think you're going to get a 100% credit. So we're going to check out the sizing tool right now so you can get a feel for it, and then I'll just share all this material at the end so you can play around with it yourself. But I just wanted you to have some sense of it so then you can use it for your own experimentation. So I'm just going to go back here. So they're both on the Vermont League of Cities and Towns website, which you can access easily. So it's an Excel document, which is great. It's important. I think it's helpful if you get the fact sheets and you use the fact sheets in conjunction with the sizing tool, because the fact sheets kind of lay out the background that you need to know, and then the sizing tool gets into the nitty-gritty. So you'll see here there are all these different sheets in the Excel doc. And the first one gives you these instructions. It sort of says, okay, this is what's going on here. This is how you can figure out what you're doing. And then it has, each of the fact sheets has a page that you can click through and use. So for our purposes, we're going to go to number 3, tree retention and planting. So you can click on there. You can give it a project name if you want, those kinds of things. And in here, in the design table, so there's 2 different options. There's a retained tree and newly planted trees. And then within those categories, you can choose evergreen or deciduous. And then it gives you a sense of what the impervious area credit maximum is. So we're going to do a little make-believe. So we're going to say this isn't linked to any number. This is just, you would call it something like area number 1. So square footage of your impervious area. So let's say we're going to be putting in a garage that's 10,000 square feet. And we have an existing 3 evergreen trees on site. And the total canopy area of our evergreen trees will say that each one is 100 square feet, so we'll have 300 square feet of canopy area. And we're going to keep 5 maple trees, and they each will say also have 100 square feet, so a total of 500 square feet. And we're also going to plant 3 new baby evergreens and 3 new oak trees. So the calculation is done after you punch in your numbers, which let's try this guy. So the numbers come up down here. So it says tree credit calculation results. The total impervious area reduction credit for retained evergreen trees is 60 square feet. Now, this might mean something different depending on what the stormwater rules in your town are, but if your town were to adopt the model bylaw and the fact sheets that are associated, that might mean that you would be getting a credit, so it would be minus 60 square feet of your total impervious area that you're installing, that you wouldn't have to manage the stormwater on. They'd say, well, you have these trees and therefore they're managing that for you. Total impervious area reduction credit for retained deciduous trees, and then these newly planted evergreens and newly planted deciduous. Total tree credits, maximum 25% of impervious area needing treatment, so it's 320 square feet. So I could go back to my project that I'm working on and subtract 320 square feet out of my 10,000 square feet and say this is an area that I won't get charged, either won't get charged a stormwater fee for or won't need to additionally manage the stormwater in some other way. And say I'm at a threshold where I really need to bring my impervious area down by 25%, I could play with the number of trees I retain or the number of new trees that I plant so that I can reach that threshold. So it's a really neat tool to be able to do that and really get at what's the value of the tree in real dollars, because if you're being charged a stormwater fee, it's related to your impervious surface area on your site. So this would really translate into real money. I'll come back here. I'll let you all catch up. I know it takes a second there. Hopefully you can all see this technology, performance, quantity, retention. So this is just one slide from a study that was put out in early 2015. It was a cool, they just basically took a bunch of stormwater studies and put together of all these different BMPs, stormwater BMPs, and said, okay, this is the kind of performance you would get for quantity retention, or this is the performance you get for phosphorus across all of these different technologies. And I pulled this out here, even though I fully realize that trees are not in this graph. But I want you to think about this: that when you look at this graph and you look at the total percent volume reduction, and what this means is, if water flows into one of these practices, how much volume is it able to retain of a storm? So if you look at the porous pavement, it's getting the highest, an average of 72%. That makes sense because porous pavement is really just an inlet to a sandy and gravel substrate. And then performing at the other end would be like the wetland and the retention pond. So the wetland, it makes sense. You're not actually getting rid of any water. It's sort of a flow-through system. So you're cleaning the water, but you're not getting rid of any of the volume. And this retention pond, similarly, you can get groundwater flow into a retention pond, so you're actually getting out more water than you're putting in. But so the point here is that trees perform better than half of these technologies that are actually designed to manage stormwater volume reduction. So trees don't even require the expensive engineering services or complicated maintenance regimes. When these practices fail, that means they don't work anymore and you're not getting any of the desired benefit. But if a tree filter fails for clogging or a leaky basement or whatever, you still have the tree. Just make sure to give the tree plenty of soil and special care as it establishes, and it will give a number of benefits. And in cases like this, even if you planted a tree because you think it looks pretty or because you want your grandkids to have shade, you would still be performing a high rate of stormwater volume reduction, and that's not even your goal. Bottom line, trees are the best. So really, it's important to protect them and plant more. Our rivers and lakes will benefit. So thank you all for doing that work in our communities. I'm happy to take any questions that you have now. I'll turn it back over to Elise to take that on.
Great. Thank you, Becky. It's so much good information and so many great visuals and resources that you've been able to provide. We do have a couple of questions that came in, and for the attendees, we do have about 10 minutes left for questions. So if you have anything that you're dying to ask Becky, feel free to either use the questions panel area or just the chat box, and I'll make sure to catch all those. But Becky, it looks like we have two questions, both from participants in Wisconsin. And so the first one, and I think these came in a little bit earlier before you actually went through that. Some of those sort of actual tools, but the first one is, can you please post links, or I guess refer to, or if you know of any links, about studies of water quality benefits of urban trees? Wisconsin DNR research demonstrates high phosphorus loading from flower and leaf debris in streets during spring and fall months, and feels that urban trees degrade urban water quality, and they fail to recognize the water quality benefits associated with water quantity reductions.
Oh yeah, that's a really good point. And about that specific point, I don't have any data to point to you for the phosphorus loading from the trees. I'm familiar with it though, from the leaf litter. Some of the work that there's been a lot of interest in around here is in scheduling street sweeping to avoid some of those impacts, because the volume reduction is so great that well-timed street maintenance and sweeping and catch basin cleaning could ameliorate some of the effect of the dropped tree leaves. You know, the other point is you don't have to use deciduous trees, and in fact you get more credit for the use of evergreen trees in terms of their ability to intercept and uptake all year. But it's a fair point. I mean, it's certainly reasonable. There's other evidence about the use of trees near pervious paving because it clogs the inlets. So it's not to say that it's without maintenance. I think, you know, when I go and talk with folks that work at for Department of Public Works or work on road crews, you know, their whole job is maintenance, but much of that maintenance that people currently do, we don't consider maintenance, or we don't consider it a burden. And you know, these are, yeah, they have full crews that all they do is maintain this infrastructure, and it's gray infrastructure. It's our conventional stormwater infrastructure, and they every day of every month of every year they spend maintaining it. But as soon as we have a different kind of maintenance strategy, it's sort of suddenly considered a burden. But I think it's really just a shift of the amount of time you're spending on one kind of maintenance to a different kind of maintenance. And I think there's evidence to suggest that the auxiliary benefits of trees for both stormwater and other benefits in urban areas indicate that that might be a better way to spend our maintenance budgets versus focusing solely on gray infrastructure.
Great, thank you. The second question from Wisconsin starts out pretty much bringing up the same point, but kind of expands and says that for those reasons, you know, there is no credit in Wisconsin storm permits for planting and retaining trees. And again, is asking if you, Becky, know of any studies that directly address the relationship between canopy and stormwater that they can specifically steer the DNR folks in Wisconsin to. And any other points on that?
Yeah, I don't have any more to add than what I've already said, but it has, you have me interested, especially, you know, with the DNR not recognizing the benefits. So I'll certainly look, and anybody else on the line, I'm sure there's other folks who are just as well informed about this. I'd love to share resources. So I'd be happy to dig up the research that I'm aware of, and I'll certainly send you along what I have.
Well, Danny just chimed in, Danielle Fitzko, our program coordinator, referring to actually our Vermont Community Forestry website. There are 3 white papers on stormwater that helped us in Vermont kind of land on the stormwater credit for trees. So if you go on the vtcommunityforestry.org site, under our resources section, we have I believe a direct link to stormwater. We're looking at it right now. Under benefits of trees. Yeah, so there's under benefits of trees, under our resources, there's a trees for water quality section, and there's some information there. Becky, do you have any thoughts on specific tree species best for stormwater management? Or I mean, I know you just mentioned about conifers getting more credit, but any other specific, just larger canopy, larger rainfall interception?
Yeah, you know, about species, I would say I would turn it over to you, Danny, and Elise about specific species. I would just say the data that I'm aware of is that the evergreens, because they have leaves all of the year, provide more interception and uptake all year. And the larger the canopy, the better. Those would really be the only 2 things. And I am not really a tree expert. I'm kind of the stormwater girl, so I'd point that to you guys. I'm sure you have some ideas.
Yeah, right. And we do also on our website have our tree selection tool, which is in our resources section again, that kind of gives you an idea of the mature size of the tree, the growth rates, their tolerance to salt, and you know, other needs in terms of light and how you're going to get that tree to get big and healthy. We have a question. What about implementing GSI in northern climates which introduce salt during the winter months to the tree? Any thoughts on that, Becky?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's an active area of research that we still have a lot of questions on. And just yesterday we held a webinar with Joe Bartlett, who is a local researcher who did a project looking at the impact of salts on streams, and some of the numbers he was showing for the loading of salt to the soils was really high. And the most important thing I heard from his talk, which I didn't know previously, was that much of the spike in salts to water bodies is actually not during the winter month. It's not when salt is being added. It's in like July and August when our base flows are really low and we have saturated soils. And that made me think a lot about trees and how they're managing the soil, the volume of salt in the soils. So that's, I guess, a long-winded way of saying yes, it's an issue, but I would point to the resources that Elise mentioned about salt-tolerant species. But it's an active area of interest and research here in trying to manage public safety with a reduction in the volume of salts we're adding, because it's not good for trees, it's not good for the soil, it's not good for our water bodies, it's not good for aquatic biota. So yeah, yep. That is all.
I know that Deep Root actually yesterday, or maybe this morning, had a blog post up about salt and trees. So I've been seeing it a lot lately, so I would suggest checking that out as well. And then just this is the last question. Using the Waterbury example and its isolated trees, what would you suggest for a succession plan? How would you plan to replace mature trees like that? And I guess more broadly, what other GSI practices, or what can the Waterbury complex be doing to ensure that those benefits are extended?
That's a great question. So in those fact sheets that Stone Environmental and the DEC had created, they have a nice section on succession planting, or when there's a damage to a tree, sort of how to establish that. And there's lots of great literature, and I would suspect that the Urban and Community Forestry Program has information on specifically how to manage succession plantings. But other ways that stormwater can be integrated into the Waterbury complex or green infrastructure, and the way trees can be used that we didn't talk about really at all today is using trees as the vegetation in bioretention systems to improve performance and uptake. So certainly that could be an element in the Waterbury complex. But if you're just talking about trees, in the Waterbury complex example, stormwater management was not at all why they were protecting the trees. So I don't know that that would be their motivation for management. They have other motivations, which I guess would ultimately result in the same thing, and that is a continuation of long-lived, large, healthy trees. So, Elise, do you have resources there for how to manage succession plantings that maybe where stormwater isn't the goal?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general we just really try to have any body, whether it's a town or it's a complex or whatnot, have a real good idea of what their not only their species diversity is, but age structure as well, and their size diversity, and to really strive for having a good diversity of age classes across the board, so that you are planning for that future when those large trees might not be there. So I think we're going to wrap it up with that. Becky's information is up on this slide, so if anybody has any direct questions for Becky, please feel free to email her. Thank you for everyone who sat in and is listening today, and you will be getting an email shortly with a very short evaluation, and we'd really appreciate it if you could just fill that out so we have a good idea about if this was useful and what other topics you might want to hear about. There's also an option in that evaluation for you to sign up for Tree Mail, which is our program's e-newsletter, and so that way we could keep you abreast of upcoming webinars, which we do in the winter, usually the last week of each month at lunchtime. And so there'll be one for the next couple months as well, though we don't know exactly what's coming up. And you can also hear about all of our other program updates as well. So thanks one last time, and I hope everyone has a lovely late January afternoon. Bye.
Thanks, Elise. Thanks, everybody. Bye.